This is Ryan's Audiobooks playlist on the Issues Magazine channel on YouTube. Today we're continuing the Psychic Bible, the apocryphal scriptures of Genesis P-Orridge and the third mind of the Temple of Psychic Youth. We're doing 1-4, beginning with the Gray Book. 1. The temple strives to end personal laziness and engender discipline, to focus the will on one's true desires in the belief, gathered from experience, that this maximizes and makes happen all those things that one wants in every area of life. Explore daily your deepest desires, fantasies, and motives, gradually focusing on what you would like to happen in a perfect world, a perfect situation, taking away all restrictions and practical considerations, what you'd really want. Then decide to try and do it. The mere visualization of that true goal begins the process that makes it happen. Clean out the trappings and debris of compromise, of what you've been told is reasonable for a person in your circumstances. Be clear in admitting your real desires. Discard all irrelevancies. Ask yourself who you want as friends, if you need or want to work, what you want to eat. Check and recheck everything, deeper and deeper, more and more precisely, to get closer to and ultimately integrate with your real self. Once you are focused on yourself internally, the external aspects of your life will fall into place. They have to. Skeptics will say they simply don't believe this psychic process works, but it does. It's the key to the temple. Genesis P-Orridge, 1981. We attempt to commune with spirits, to be friends of the human spirit. We care for the infinite significance of one individual spirit and personal moral responsibility, and its development through experience. We believe in the total significance of the individual, discovered through familiarity with the deepest instincts and explorations of destiny outside the traps of time. We intend to engender moral freedom, spiritual freedom, sexual freedom, and personal independence, to insist upon personal choice in all things. We are endlessly involved in unraveling the intertwined yet separate threads of fate and destiny to evolve a magical system to maximize and enhance each individual's ability to recognize and focus on, thereby making real that destiny. We accept responsibility, gladly and with excitement and deliberate ignorance of the outcome. We revel in mystery and surprise. We bury ourselves in challenge and dreams. We embrace all possibilities and impossibilities with joy and excitement. We accept the true nature of life the way it is, the way the world is, flexible and shifting in flux every moment, shaped by parallel levels that accept contradiction and inconsistency as inviolate qualities that generate mystery and mastery. We direct ourselves wherever we choose to go with joy and abandon. A new era of the magical interpretation of the world existing in it is coming, an interpretation in terms of will and imagination by contact with intuition and instinct. Do you want to be part of a world of sleeping people? Do you want to imbibe the drug of the commonplace? Will you be forever addicted to self-restriction? Established orthodoxies and dogmas, conditioned interpretations of living, regard the material world as reality, whilst pretending to deal with the spirit or existence. They conceive and propagate evolution in thinking as purely physical, their control of our visions as sacrosanct. Religion has been privately altered to work from a position that accepts itself as totally discredited by science. All establishment modes of control and affiliation, both religious and political, rely upon and revolve around unquestioning faith and dogma, unquestioning acceptance of their inalienable right to assume professional responsibility for our actions upon their shoulders. We are told we are weak, incapable of grasping scale, afraid of ourselves and desperate to push responsibility for all events in our lives onto them. We are insistently trained to accept our corporeal existence as hopeless in itself, to become subservient to the greater good. We are perpetually conditioned, encouraged, and blackmailed into self-restriction, into narrower and narrower perceptions of ourselves, of our own importance, our own potential, and our own experience. We are trained to ignore the evidence of our senses and experiences and to feel guilt when we glimpse sense-derived visions of ourselves as free spirits. The voluntary relinquishing of responsibility for our lives and actions is one of the greatest enemies of our times. Our enemies are flat. Our enemies are three-dimensional. Our enemies are continuity and coherence. Our enemies are restriction and confinement. Our enemies are guilt and fear. Our enemies are material. Our enemies are direction and fact. Our enemies are because. We are not seeking followers, we are seeking collaborators, individuals for a visionary psychic alliance. What we suggest next is not instruction. It is a method which can be used by anyone, alone with friends, regardless of any material or social circumstances. A method to be used by the individual to break through to their deeper consciousness, where fantasies, ambitions, and real wishes reside. The place where all dreams meet. People can most readily identify and relate to dreams that are sexual, and that is the primary reason for our choice of sex as a vehicle for this method to begin with. Our interest is therefore practical. In our experience, although they might deny it, most people never ask themselves what they really want, or they simply say that they don't know. But it is only once a person has learned to identify their true desires in an imaginary perfect world, where guilt and retribution are suspended, that they can hope to reach them. Sex. Of all the things people do at home and in private, usually with close friends, sex alone is subject to extraordinary interference and control from outside forces. This is no accident. They recognize its power. Even if only for a few moments, individuals can release a power and energy from within that renders any system of society or regime meaningless. It's a liberator. Even an individual in solitary confinement can indulge in it, and their fantasies travel into any situation and possibility unfettered, and at the moment of orgasm itself be both blissfully vulnerable and undeniably free, elsewhere filled by energy. Accordingly, from the moment of birth, pressure is exercised upon everyone to limit their release and enjoyment of this power, to limit and restrict the immense potential. Of course, the nature of this pressure varies by place and era. When specific laws become unenforceable for a time, more subtle methods are used. Social attitudes, anxiety, guilt, fear of ridicule, and failure are all exploited, and diseases that attack only those who indulge in specific sexual activities are introduced, most given to this pressure in one way or another, permanently crippling their individual growth. We believe that it is essential, if we are to survive and progress, that we first recognize, accept, and ultimately reach our true sexual desires. This not only satisfies the body and consolidates the spirit, but acts as an example for all our sexuality, so it seems crucial to begin at this universally applicable point and develop our awareness from there. In our culture, people have internalized alienating stereotypes that dictate their sexual and social interactions. This makes men agreeable to orders from authority figures and keeps women in line with accepted notions of propriety and authority, and binds up their sexual desires so they will accept a generally subordinate role to men. The latter is propagated by those who are empowered by the patriarchal lineage which has been handed down through the ages, whose fear of the unknown, in this case women in feminine characteristics, has been countered by a bulwark of dogma which aims at controlling and or degrading all these forces which they see as a threat to their reign. By studying the oppression of women through the ages, we can see in a nutshell the nature, methods, and manifestations of oppression as it is used in any society and in any age against those who are pro-life, not in the abortion sense, and expanding. Yet on a broad scale, encompassing both sexes, the repression of sexual instincts functions to make people submissive and inclined to irrational behavior, and thus paralyzes their rebellious potential. On a deeply personal level, where we enter the domain of such energies as might be called magical, the effect of such conditioning is no less significant. Psychic energy and sexual energy are different names for the same force. By ridding ourselves of restrictions and the forms of control that have been imposed on us, we could come into our own on more planes than one. Most initiates of the temple believe there is a power and effect released by an orgasm, focused through will, that enhances not only the process of self-fulfillment and contentment, but also the achievement of creative goals. The strength of this process forces the hand of chance and brings close the objects of your desire. And I will add as a note, both literally and figuratively. Ritual. Throughout history, man has used ritual to achieve spiritual results from simple physical actions. Recently, its use has been limited to established religious dogmas. And since many, if not all, of these have fallen into disrepute or have come to be seen as irrelevant, so too is the use of ritual. But its use is far older and more universal than any organized church. Any ritual is a way of concentrating and focusing those taking part on a particular aim or idea. It is only essential that the techniques employed have meaning and vitality for the participants. Seen without this belief, as many recorded rituals of the past are now, the processes can seem simply ridiculous, and the mechanical repetition of them certainly would be. Initiates of the Temple of Psychic Youth have developed personal methods or rituals not only to strengthen and refine their inner objectives, both sexual and practical, but also to provide a fertile basis for those objectives to grow and become real. Although we have no vested interest in others following this example or contacting the temple, it is possible that some people will wish to do so. Below are instructions on how to do this. Many people may feel unwilling or unable to put our suggestions into practice due to the effectiveness of social conditioning. The temple will only draw initiates from those who can demonstrate in the manner indicated their resistance to this conditioning and their commitment to the ideals of the temple. The Sigil of 3 Liquids. This ritual should be performed alone on the 23rd of the month, beginning at 23 hours, in a place where you will have no interruptions or distractions. Within the limits of what is practical, you should arrange the environment and atmosphere to be as conducive as possible to the execution of this sigil for yourself. If at all possible, a candle or candles should be the only source of light. The sigil must be performed naked. One of the aims of the ritual is to concentrate your attention and energy on your most intense sexual fantasy. To do this, you must first decide what it is and write it down on a piece of paper. It should be what you think would generate in you the maximum possible excitement, pleasure, and fulfillment, regardless of the identity, sex, or age of those who take part with you, alive and guiltless. It is essential to be completely honest with yourself and not write something because you think it might satisfy other people. Remember that the purpose of the sigil is to make these things really happen. Once you have written the fantasy on the piece of paper, you have to make the paper special. To do this, it must be touched by the 3 liquids of the body, that is spit, blood, and OV, which is the temple name for the fluids obtained by masturbation, semen from the male, and lubrication from the female. For example, let a few drops of spit fall onto the page, and next a few drops of blood. You must use some kind of sharp and clean instrument to do this. Remember that only a small quantity is required, and you should use your common sense in terms of the method employed and hygiene both before and after the ritual. Lastly, and in any way that is most pleasurable to you, bring yourself to orgasm and allow the OV to touch the paper. While you are doing this, concentrate not only on the inscribed fantasy, but also on the idea of the temple and the fact that doing this sigil is inevitably bringing closer what you really want. You must then attach a lock of hair from your head and also some of your pubic hair to the paper. Remember that these 2 hair types and 3 liquids may be incorporated on the sigil paper in any manner that feels appropriate to the thoughts thereon described. The basic actions outlined above should not be seen as limitation. Leave the sigil paper overnight to dry in a safe place. On the next day, send it to the temple. You do not have to attach your name to the sigil paper if you don't want to. All submissions to the temple will remain at all times absolutely confidential and will be stored in a locked vault. All applications who complete this satisfactorily will receive personal encouragement, suggestions, and directions for the subsequent month's ritual. Completion of 23 such monthly rituals qualifies one as a full initiate of the temple. Note: if you decide to do the sigil, the responsibility rests entirely with you. You will gain from it, not the temple. The temple cannot accept any claims against it, arising from the consequence of the sigil or any related matters. The sigil can only be recommended to those who have reached the legal age of consent in the country in which they live. In modern society, most people are not able to tolerate concentrated religious thought. This is hardly surprising. Most religious and political groups of the last 2 centuries have stressed, among other things, the superiority of their leaders and the inferiority of the individual. By now, the absurdity of this thinking has become apparent to most people, and a general resistance to any form of religious dogma has developed. There are a number of groups in cult religions that are repeating the old formulas of adoration of their leaders and the relinquishing of the cult's followers by any responsibility for their own lives, but these are in the minority. By and large, people have lost faith in any spiritual teaching whatsoever, and have nothing with which to replace it. If we are able to suggest even guidelines in this area, they must be done without dogma and in ways that people will understand. Pleasure has become something which people do not seek after themselves, but instead have presented to them in simulated forms through diverse media, thus building up a frustrating and paradoxical situation where an inherently active form of expression has become a passive pastime, and the results are that expression becomes depression. People are constantly being titillated through advertisements and other forms of propaganda by a subtle use of subliminal seduction. Due to the one-sided nature of the affair, the outcome is inevitably frustration. When pleasure's course is inhibited, it has the characteristic of turning into unpleasure. When, in spite of continual high excitation, a person is not able to experience final gratification, a fear eventually develops, not only of the final gratification, but also of the excitation that precedes it. This will effectively divorce the individual from his or her true feelings and instincts. A long exposure to televisualized reality will have the effect of underlining people's notions about their inadequacy. On an unconscious level, they will have to deal with secondhand traumas and complexes, a task made all the more difficult for the fact that, although the pseudo-experiences achieve their relevance by being linked up with the individual's own experiences, the link is mostly superficial and difficult to trace. Electronic media is man's latest sensory apparatus. The manipulation and use made of the sexual instinct through visual media has turned a large portion of people into unknowing fetishists. They are investing sexual energy in images and objects without knowing it, and are thus unable to reclaim and make use of that energy, as the magical use of a fetish dictates. An essentially magical act has become vampiric and one-sided. This process breeds a host of scopophiles, people who obtain simulated sexual gratification through the process of watching, where the illusion of active doing is obtained by turning another person into an object which is subjected to a controlling gaze. Scopophilia is, by definition, one of the component instincts of sexuality that exists as drives independently of the erotogenic zones. Indulging in scopophilic activity, and people nowadays hardly seem to have any other choice, can, in the long run, result in an unconscious acceptance of the separation between mind and body, sexuality being denied its natural course. This fragmented worldview that keeps people from drawing the right conclusions and seeking active release from their circumstances is reinforced. Over the last 50 years, TV has been the greatest single factor in the control of the attitudes of the people. Even if it was unintentional, which seems unlikely, the prevailing view of the world as seen by the writers, producers, and controllers of TV companies has become the accepted norm to which the viewer inevitably compares herself. Of course, the world presented on TV bears little or no relation to reality, and as a consequence, the viewer is left not only with a feeling of failure, but also of boredom with the perfect world of the screen. Even in the area of news and documentary, those interests that shape and control TV is everywhere assume that the public cannot cope with the whole truth. It is our intention to reverse this trend. We have no desire to ape or emulate the slick perfection and sterile technical quality of traditional professional television. Perfect focus is not perfect content. We deal in implications, exactness of flow, and image from a subliminal psychic point of view. It is only by doing this that one can hope to show life as it really is. All media systems devised by man enshrine his own limitations of development and fulfillment, his inner conflicts, his private fears of mortality. Yet all media, including TV, are nothing but the decisions of men. Psychic TV will be activist, a positive statement of faith in the capacity of man, to cause things hidden in the dark to appear, and to take the darkness away from them. Psychic TV is not intended to be a replacement for conventional programming, but rather the first step towards deprogramming, without regard for the preoccupations of commercial TV, or redundant assumptions about entertainment and value. At Psychic TV, we accept and exploit the way TV is used by our generation, as raw material to be manipulated by the viewer. Dense enough to be interesting over and over, yet without punchlines or obvious focal points to become familiar and bored with. The transmissions we are now producing are intended to be viewed between the hours of midnight and 6 a.m. We will not be given any advance indication of the specific contents of the transmissions. Rarely are people aware in advance of any momentous occurrence in their lives. But everything will reflect the way the world really is. If they seem to be emphasizing those aspects of life normally suppressed or censored as subversive, contentious, disturbing, or too sexual, it is because that suppression is a deliberate attempt to limit the knowledge of the individual. It is our belief that truth and information about anything and everything must be made available in every way possible, if human history is to survive, progress, or have any meaning whatsoever. Genesis P-Orridge, 1982. I continue. A message from the temple. 1. To say in day-to-day life that something is quote-unquote obvious means, more often than not, that one concedes a note of truth in exchange for a tolerance of the usual hypocrisy and conditioning. You can, for example, make your opposite admit as being obvious that there's no such thing as a theory that is absolutely true. That will not stop them in any way from continuing to brandish their quote-unquote truths as before. Their momentary concession passes by a sordid business in which they buy their future peace of mind, a life without questions. Hence, there is no higher aim than the obvious. It is to approach the closest to a truth, which we know to be inaccessible, but whose gleam we can see. The obvious is a protection. Not only does it make people run away, but it also deceives by its vapid commonness, and by the fact that in flat people's minds, whatever is simple cannot be serious. Jean-Pierre Turmel, 1982. 2. It would be an illusion to think that the individual can hide all the clues to his oneness. Their task is therefore to see to it that all the clues are wrongly interpreted. Thus it is that they may seem to indicate a lack of individuality and create a feeling of disappointment rather than curiosity. This tactic gives us space and protection in the traps of time. An individual has many personalities or characters in the same time or alternate times. Cognitive science supports this. Most people, little by little, eliminate the personalities considered to be dangerous by their peer group or societal unit, and finally keep only the social personality. They are one-dimensional, flat people. But other people, called paradoxically, quote-unquote, individuals, are always trying to develop all their personalities, even if there is an internal conflict between them. So we can clearly see that the individualist person logically must use, quote, we, to name themselves, whilst the person who belongs to the masses must use the, quote, I. The first is multidimensional, the second is unidimensional. One of the temple functions is to encourage and support the development of multidimensional individuals, hence our use of, quote-unquote, all capitals, we, in our texts. Our enemies are flat. Jean-Pierre Turmel, 1982. 3. Our stress on self-discipline is important. It links the internal methods of ritual to our approval and suggestion of other forms of physical discipline to complement the mental and sexual ones. Hence, you will often find that initiates of the temple will be engaged in such outside activities as marksmanship, martial arts, swimming, and so on, as an extension of the theory of maintaining and improving one's focus and abilities. The point is not the skill itself, though we appreciate the practical nature, in a society such as ours, of an ability to defend oneself and be fit, but the application, the discipline itself. So one may be poor in terms of results, but excellent in terms of your genuine application to a skill that requires thought, coordination, and a degree of dedication. A synthesis of physical action, thought, reflex, and an analysis of both yourself and a target, real and metaphorical. Genesis P-Orridge and Kim Glinzer Norris, 1982. I continue on. We're still reading The Gray Book 1 in the Psychic Bible by Genesis P-Orridge and others. Faith is fear. The first lesson, which all others grow, is the simplest. We are mortal. We all die. This is not a morbid wallowing in hopelessness. It is the ability to genuinely come to terms with our physical transience that liberates us all. Many visionary philosophical systems include the quote-unquote small death in their ideas under one name or another. We all die. This realization, truly assimilated, can be turned to positive use in that it spurs one to action, aware that all time is limited and no lifespan is certain. Every second counts and must count. This realization can also be used unproductively, crippling an individual man or woman's search for fulfillment of all their needs and preventing for all their life a complete integration of every aspect of their character and thoughts. The inevitability of death can be used by outside forces as a weapon to create fear. Religions often use this weapon more blatantly than any other suppressive social regulation systems. They use fear of death to justify faith. And editor's note, so-called. Note, those who escape the traps of religion through a first-stage cynical knowledge of the hypocrisy of modern society and the emasculation of their individual power to change anything often seek oblivion from this knowledge, and so they use various drugs, tobacco, alcohol, tranquilizers, and opiates like heroin as a substitute for faith. They want to kill time. Religion wants to sidestep time. Both are actions based on fear. Mankind spends a constant amount of energy in self-preservation. The very phrase self-preservation implies a threat of annihilation and is triggered by fear of death. So in a very real sense, the fear of death is present behind all normal functioning. It resides permanently in the unconscious, molding our image of ourselves in relation to an inevitable, inexorable crisis of death. Yet fear of death could not be constantly present in our day-to-day conscious mental functioning. This would be an intolerable burden. To behave quote-unquote normally, the biological organism, the animal man, represses its knowledge of death to acquire comfort. As things are, so they must change. So we are all socially and biologically conditioned to put away our fear of death, yet in a real paradox, we become too efficiently oblivious to this fear in our conscious life. The temple tries to reconcile all our consciousnesses. To do this, it embraces the knowledge of our own inevitable death with courage and uses it to justify action and the proper use of time. In actual fact, none of us know how much time we have, but when we do die, it ought to be with zero regret. Zero regret is the magical state of inner balance and calm acceptance of the mortality of individuals and the use of zero regret to channel all future action. The perfect state is to be sure that no time is wasted, no energy repressed, and no fear hidden. In old language, we must experience the small death of literally facing ourselves and facing the reality of a temporary metabolism, a limit of time, on time. Time can be a tool, a liberator, or an oppressor. When we claim time back for ourselves, we are at last learning to be free and effective. Control needs time like a junkie needs junk. To escape control, we must re-embrace our given time. Initially, the human being has no apparent alternative but to succumb to negative appreciation of death, to feel fear. The brain is genetically programmed for survival and will not allow itself to believe that it shall cease to exist. Thus, as we have already seen, the unconscious mind will seduce the intellect into ignoring logic and fact, a condition bordering upon hopelessness. It will ignore the lessons of experience and observation in favor of an inherited image of existence, and the affect of fear will be repressed. One will immediately become vulnerable to a desire for hope that bypasses a confrontation with unconscious knowledge. Religion thrives upon this. It requires only an act of blind faith in exchange for guaranteed hope and salvation. It denies death and avoids the facts. In short, religion turns away from the truth. The temple turns towards it. If you face yourself, you face death, and in this way only you can reintegrate your entire character in all its levels of consciousness and perception. This cannot be stressed too much or too often. So, in religion, all practical thought must be swept aside in a flood of faith. Answers become words, and facts become sins. This thing, faith, is the foundation of all religious thought. Editor's note from Ryan. I don't agree with that completely. Reading on. So powerful yet fragile, faith must be protected. Protected from doubt, protected from questions. It is seen as a constant that will not even tolerate thought. Its causes, its real essence, death, are so entrenched in everyone's mind that it has become the basis of every society, and so every society has developed a system to protect it. Dogma. The equation simplified goes something like this. Dogma negates thought. Thought is the enemy of faith, and therefore the enemy of society. Individual thought patterns are discouraged in order to preserve faith inviolate, to thus preserve society, to preserve the status quo in the vested interest of the keepers of faith and dogma. It is in this web that religion meets politics, and they reinforce each other in a web of deceit. Those in power have a personal interest in channeling individual thought down to safe, unthreatening avenues, geared to the production of materials and services that are to the quote-unquote benefit of society, of the quote-unquote greater good. In other words, you sacrifice your time, and your time is your most precious commodity. When you take yourself back, it becomes priceless. People are deflected from the theft of their time and trained in how to produce and consume, instead of in how to be engaged in their habitat and ideas. Politics organizes and religion directs. From a child of 5 to an adult is a short step. From a newborn baby to a child of 5 is an appalling distance. Quoted from Tolstoy. Religion invades the child's world. A child without guilt is thus given guilt. A child without fear is thus given fear. The only salvation offered is through faith. Faith, it is suggested, ends death. The price of cheating death through faith is, of course, submission. One more editor's note here. They're using general terms about religion, but they're specifically talking about monotheistic Western religion. Carrying on. People who are not satisfied with this situation, people who want proofs, who wish to develop a system without guilt and fear that absorbs and uses death as a positive and liberating knowledge, are discouraged, ridiculed, treated with suspicion, and often deliberately misrepresented in the media. They are, after all, a threat to society to some degree. They strike at the core of the trick that controls us, and so in a real sense they are dangerous. The Temple of Psychic Youth is dedicated to the reacquisition by individuals of their allotted time. It encourages, it does not discourage. It stands as an example of what is possible. To be involved is to become very special. With the passage of history, society's control over individuals has been so progressively subtle that it has become imperceptible, perhaps even genetically inherited. Its very power lies in the fact that even its figureheads and leaders do not know its processes. Control is invisible. Time is invisible. Control is so able to shroud an individual's perception of reality and trivia as to become a uniform reality in itself. A reality that cannot ask itself questions, that cannot even formulate a language capable of setting questions that might reveal a truth. In an age of collapse and transition, we must find a language, a way out of the corner donated to us by history. The human brain must develop, become the next step in evolution. It is simply that we must develop our latent neurological powers or die as a race. It is a war for survival. Through experiment, through exploration of these latent powers, by visionary use of science and technology, and by the integration of experience, observation, and expression, we must revere ourselves. A reality that cannot face itself becomes an illusion, cannot be real. We must reject totally the concept and use of faith, that sham. We must emasculate religion. The universe of magic is within the mind of mankind. The setting is but illusion even to the thinker. The temple is committed to building a modern network, where people are given back pride in themselves, where destruction becomes a laughable absurdity to a brain aware of its infinite and immeasurable potential. The temple is committed to triggering the next evolutionary cycle in order to save this flawed but lovable animal man. The temple is committed to developing a modern, functional, and inspiring magical structure, and engendering it at long last the complete, integrated, and effective individual. And this network of individuals is in turn inevitably faced with the task of action to communicate survival and social evolution to others. We are the first truly non-aligned and non-mystical philosophy. Fear breeds faith. Faith uses fear. Reject faith, reject fear, reject religions, reject dogma. Learn to cherish yourself, appreciate intuition and instinct. Learn to love your questions, value your time. Use mortality to motivate action in a caring, compassionate, and concentrated life. Genesis P-Orridge with Simon Dwyer, 1980. That concludes the Gray Book in the Psychic Bible. From time to time, I'm going to add little editor's notes. I'll try to condense them at the end like I'm doing right now. But I do feel like it is important to have small commentaries on things just to keep the mental machine lubricated and to let the words get in the way they're supposed to, instead of causing problems, because sometimes other people phrase things in ways that we wouldn't phrase them ourselves, and our hackles go up. But this is a good book to trust, and these are good people to listen to. So I do recommend that you try to listen to it from a point of view of vulnerability and interest, and resist the natural human urge to debate with it in your own mind. But wrestling with it's good. It's always good to wrestle with religious text, and this is a religious text. So keep that in mind too. Thank you for listening, and tomorrow we'll continue on with the Psychic Bible 1.5, Temporary Temple 2.